Faith has the divine right, the right of absolute self-identity or of pure thought, as against enlightenment, and receives at its hands nothing but wrong. For enlightenment distorts all the moments of faith, changing them into something different from what they are in it. But enlightenment has only a human right as against faith and for the support of its own truth. For the wrong it commits is the right to be non-identical and consists in perverting and altering a right which belongs to the nature of self-consciousness as against simple essential being or thought. But since the right of enlightenment is the right of self-consciousness, it will not only retain its own right so that two equal rights of spirit could be left confronting each other, neither being capable of satisfying the other, it will maintain its absolute right because self-consciousness is the negativity of the notion, a negativity which is active not only on its own account, but which also takes within its grasp its opposite. And because faith is a consciousness, it will not be able to deny enlightenment its right. In rereading and thinking about paragraph 563, I have this experience that is so frequent in going back through Hegel. You know, the dialectic is proceeding on its way, and of course it's not a straight path. It's very bumpy, lots of ups and downs, lots of twists and turns. But every once in a while, Hegel will say something that just sort of arrests you and makes you say, wow, that's an interesting idea. If only he continued to spell that out a little bit more here in the context of the phenomenology. Some of these he will in other places. And the real winner as far as that goes here is this notion of the right to be non-identical. If you think about that just for a moment, what does this mean? The right to be non-identical. Now, oftentimes we're thinking about rights as, something that, in this classic sense, they belong to us and nobody else should interfere with them. And if they do, maybe we'll sue them or we'll defend our rights with force or something like that. And there is some of that aspect there. But we talk about having rights because there's some sort of ground that they come from, and they embody some sort of moral norm, and German Recht certainly includes that. It's not just I've got the right. I know it's a stupid right. In that sort of context, to say, there's no good reason for me to have this right, but the court gave it to me. That's not really a right from the Hegelian point of view. And so he is talking about something really fundamental here, that is belonging to the side of the Enlightenment, the right to be non-identical. And we might think about this in our own time in ways that I don't think Hegel really has in mind. As a matter of fact, ways that defenders of what they consider to be the Enlightenment and the present view as undermining the Enlightenment. If you think about somebody who says, hey, I don't want to be confined within the gender spectrum, I want to say maybe I'm out here and the spectrum is over here, and I don't really fit into the identity that is being assigned to me, so I'm being non-identical. I'm not being the same thing in this context as I am in this context. It's not exactly the same thing that Hegel's talking about here, but it's not completely alien to it either. The right to change one's mind, to follow reason where reason goes, and perhaps even in a sort of Dostoevskian underground man kind of way, perhaps there's even the right to stick your tongue out or give the finger to the Crystal Palace. And this is something that Enlightenment can't really control. This is one of the things that's quite interesting. Again, this is a bit of a digression, but You don't get the post-Enlightenment and the hostile to the Enlightenment without having the Enlightenment, and it comes out of the Enlightenment and the very freedom and progress that the Enlightenment brings. It's the dark side of the Enlightenment. So, all that said, let's take a look at the text, right? It says, faith has the divine right. What we've got here is actually a clash, as he's saying, between two different rights. Faith has the divine right. And opposed to that is the human right of the Enlightenment. Have we seen this dynamic before? We've seen it earlier in the Spirit section, have we not? And how is this going to get resolved? So he says, faith has the divine right, the right of absolute self-identity. Sich Selbstgleichheit, right? Gleichheit, similarity, being the same as, sameness you could say. Sich selbst, being the same as oneself. Interesting that we use this word identity, right? And we normally think of identity as sort of like the core, you've got A equals A. Well, even in saying A equals A, you've got two A's there. And you've got that equal sign. It's already a complex, mediated relation. That's what Hegel would point out to us. And the German language kind of reflects that. It's lost here in the English translation. Identity, right? A equals A. A equals A equals A. A. Let's stick with just one A. Make it really simple. Sich selbst Gleichheit, being similar, as a matter of fact, indiscernibly similar to one's very self. It's a reflexive relation, and it turns the self that is identical into two in order to turn it into one. I know that may sound a little paradoxical, but that is really what's going on there at a sort of semantic level that we can explore. So he says, faith has this divine right, the right of absolute self-identity or of pure thought. Faith has something going for it. Faith has some conception of the divine, and that conception of the divine as something it can rely upon, can draw upon. And it's going to have some representation associated with it, some content, as we've seen, and that gives the person operating from faith something to hold on to. They can say, on this I take my stand. You know what reference that is, of course, to Martin Luther. Here I take my stand, right? And we can say similar things about the faith. So he says, it receives at Enlightenment's hands nothing but wrong. How does it receive wrong from the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment misrepresents it, right? Sort of like two people telling stories. Well, you're always doing this. It's like doing couples counseling, right? Between faith and Enlightenment. And Enlightenment thinks that it's got the entire story, and faith is coming back and saying, you've misrepresented me. Here, 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 and here, right? And Enlightenment can say the same thing to faith. Enlightenment can actually say, you didn't just misrepresent me, you don't even understand what I'm talking about, because you're too primitive, right? And he goes on and he says, how does this happen? Enlightenment distorts all the moments of faith, changing them into something different from what they are in it. Different than they are in what? In faith and its perspective. Enlightenment looks at faith from the outside, or perhaps from the inside as somebody who left faith, and they're like, see, you do this. You understand the absolute being in terms of the pictures or in terms of the idols of lead. You don't actually have an ethical content to your religion. You don't understand the human being and their relation to the divine. We understand that. You've got all this crazy nonsense stuff like, go here and pray there at this time of the day and, eat this thing and don't eat that thing. See, you don't really get it. That's the way Enlightenment talks to faith, and faith can say, what are you talking about? Who says this sort of stuff? And you see this constantly in atheist-theist polemics on YouTube, on comment streams. They're almost always, or I won't say almost always, I'll say At least 75% of the time that I watch that sort of stuff, I just see people talking past each other because they're misrepresenting each other. And that's been going on now for several hundred years. Hegel was writing about this as an old dynamic in 1807, right? More than 200 years ago, it was already something that had been going on for several hundred years. So, if you think that this is actually one of the reasons why Hegel, this is a bit of a digression, right? This is one of the reasons why Hegel's phenomenology can, in fact, be so useful. Without us worrying about where we're going to end up at the end, these dynamics are still playing themselves out with shapes of consciousness, i.e. human beings and their mentalities in the present today, and they're still doing the same sort of thing. And so this can give us maybe a blueprint for how to get out of these stupid impasses, if people do, in fact, want to get out of them. So he goes on and he says, it changes these moments of faith into something different than what they are. But enlightenment, he says, has only a human right against faith, right? And for the support of its own truth. And then he says, for the wrong it commits is the right to be non-identical. So this being non-identical is not just about how it defines itself, but how it defines itself in relation to its other, and how it defines both of them in relation to the entire social world that they both inhabit. Remember, culture is still lurking in the background of all of this, is it not? So he goes on, and he tells us that we've got this right to be self-identical on the side of enlightenment, and it consists in perverting and altering. When it's carrying out its critique of faith, it does in fact pervert. It does in fact, turn to a different use, turn to twist the words, you might say. That's another great way for talking about perversion. And altering, changing what it is that faith is in fact doing and saying and representing to itself. He says, this is a right which belongs to the nature of self-consciousness as against simple essential being or thought. This is a very important point. We've talked about this at a number of other places, particularly in the reason section, when we were talking about how it's possible to interpret what somebody else is putting forward, and how it's always possible to add like your own twist to it. And this is really essential to human beings. This is part of why the physiognomy and phrenology stuff doesn't actually work, and with all the implications it has for similar metrics being carried out in the present, but with much more sophisticated equipment. Likewise, social dynamics, statistical modeling works to a certain extent, but the human beings can always say, oh, there's your model, screw you, I'm not going to follow your model. Or, I think your model's oppressive. Or, maybe I'll follow it, but I'll reserve the right to screw with it at any time I want. Hegel views this as essential to consciousness as opposed to any sort of pure thought. This is a moment, this is human freedom playing itself out in the Enlightenment. So this is incredibly important. And now notice what he says. Since the right of enlightenment is the right of self-consciousness, it will not only retain its own right, the human right, so that two equal rights of spirit could be left confronting each other, neither capable of satisfying the other, neither able to have any sort of resolution, it will maintain its absolute right. This trumps the divine right. You might say it converts this into a no longer divine right, because the divine is the absolute, right? It will maintain its absolute right because self-consciousness, he says, is the negativity of the notion, a negativity which is active not only on its own account, but he says, which also takes within its grasp its opposite. If enlightenment can do more than just pervert and alter and can actually take into account what's going on the side of faith, then enlightenment really does deserve to have the last word. You could say the same thing on the side of faith. But of course, enlightenment is already, several steps ahead of faith here historically. It's got an advantage. It doesn't have the encumbrance of having all sorts of traditions and images and rituals and people who actually believe in that stuff to try to drag into the new centuries. The notion is going to demand that alterity be grasped and incorporated into the account. So he says it takes into its grasp its opposite, and he says, because faith is a consciousness, it will not be able to deny enlightenment its right. This is very interesting to close on, isn't it? Hegel, again, tells us faith is not just a bunch of people sitting around, who learn something as kids and, never think otherwise and just mumble and do rituals and stuff like that. Faith is a form of consciousness. It is thought. Precisely because it is consciousness, it's not going to be able to resist enlightenment the way that it would like to. For enlightenment does not employ principles peculiar to itself in its attack on faith, but principles which are implicit in faith itself. Enlightenment merely presents faith with its own thoughts which faith unconsciously lets fall apart, but which enlightenment brings together. It merely reminds faith, when each of its own modes is present to it, of the others which it also has, but which it always forgets when the other one is present. Enlightenment shows itself to faith to be pure insight by the fact that in a specific moment it sees the whole, brings forward the other moment which is opposed to it, and converting one into the other, brings to notice the negative essence of both thoughts, the notion. To faith it seems to be a perversion and a lie because it points out the otherness of its moments. In doing so, it seems directly to make something else out of them than they are in their separateness. But this other is equally essential and in truth is present in the believing consciousness itself. Only this does not think about it, but puts it away somewhere. Consequently, it is neither alien to faith, nor can faith disavow it. In paragraph 564, Hegel now is going to tell us how it is that faith comes under attack from enlightenment, or pure insight, if you like. And he shows how enlightenment uses the very nature or structure or tissue of faith against itself in a way that faith considers a bit unfair, but is, there to be exploited. So that, what we have here is not the sort of crude, science solves everything, and people of faith, they were totally anti-science from the start, sort of narrative that a lot of contemporary atheists like to put out there. Because as we know, the sciences were in large part developed by people of faith within, matrices of faith. The Middle Ages were not as dark as people like to pretend, and the Renaissance certainly wasn't as secular as people like to pretend either, nor even was the Enlightenment itself. But what's going on here that's particularly important is how Enlightenment is, you might say, sharing the same ground, and as faith sees it, perverting things. So, it says, in its attack on faith, enlightenment does not employ principles peculiar to itself. It doesn't actually have any principles peculiar to itself, as we've seen so far. It's in the process of trying to develop and articulate those, right? But for the most part, it's negative. So it doesn't have, principles peculiar to itself, but it uses principles that are implicit in faith itself. The very desire for, say, absolute truth, right? And here's a great example of where Hegel, in many respects, remains a metaphysician of the old stripe, but self-consciously so, in a way that some of his successors, like Friedrich Nietzsche or Martin Heidegger, just to name a few, are going to try to leave behind. There's a sort of radical departure in this respect. Hegel's willing to say, yeah, Christianity, other religions, they were indeed bringing truth, capital T, on the scene, and modern philosophy does do that better, Not all modern philosophy, but certainly Hegelian modern philosophy, in his view. Nietzsche will say, in the genealogy, those philosophers and the men of science, they're really theologians at heart. They're just theologians that took God out of the picture and put something else in there, like nature or science or whatever you like. But they still believe in some sort of capital T truth, and they're still, the critique that they produce against each other successively is really just drawn from the same body of principles that go much further back. Heidegger is going to say something similar, and we can go on and on and on. There's a bit of a digression, but if you want to see a really interesting sort of way of representing this in a play, there is a great play, I believe it's called Ghost Sonata by August Strindberg, where there's theology, philosophy, medicine representing science, and law. And each one of them successfully, defeats the other and tells the other, aha, see, you're nothing. Law is the one who has the final say. Philosophy says to theology, what you do is really primitive. Science, medicine says to philosophy, I do what's scientific much better than you do. And law comes to all of them and says, what's up with you dummies? This is very much paraphrasing, right? I'm the one who rules everything, right? So heading back to this, after that digression, insight, enlightenment, is using faith's ideas, tendencies, desires, projects against itself. He says, enlightenment merely presents faith with its own thoughts, which faith unconsciously lets fall apart. Remember, faith is a mode of thinking for human beings. And thinking involves a whole bunch of different thoughts. And those thoughts may not all be harmonious with each other. Or they may start out harmonious at one time, and like he says, they start to fall apart from each other. And you see this all the time happen with religions. Some people are like, this is the thought that really matters the most. All this other stuff, bunk. Get rid of it, right? There you've got a definite contradiction. That's how you get sects and heresies and splittings and all that sort of stuff going on, and persecutions as well. So what enlightenment is doing is looking at what it is that faith takes as important and saying, listen, this stuff doesn't all fit together. You're acting as if this all maps onto each other and fits in well, but I'm telling you, I'm looking at it, and if you buy into this, you can't also have this. Or at least you're going to have to totally re-understand the way that they fit together. So he goes on and he says, it merely reminds faith when one of its own modes is present to it, of the others, which it also has, but which it always forgets when the other one is present. And what would be some examples of this? The philosopher saying to the person of faith who seems to be kind of in a bit of a contradiction when it comes to whether we have genuine freedom or not. On the one hand, they find the person saying, well, God has a plan that takes into account everything. This is what we call providence. And isn't that consoling to know that, God's mysterious ways are going to take care of everything? And then at the same time, you're also praying and you're saying, God, please let things come out this way. And the person, of enlightenment is like, listen, either God already made up his mind in the past from all eternity, however you want to conceive of it, or you can change his mind by praying. But which is it going to be? You can't have both of these. And the religious believer, may say, well, that's also a mystery as well. But if they do that, they may actually feel kind of a twinge. They may be like, that's not a very good answer at all, is it? And if they're quite sophisticated, they may say, I am not a good apologeticist. Some people do get quite guilty over that. But this is something that happens. And this happens in the present, just like it happened in the past. So he goes on and he says, enlightenment shows itself to faith to be pure insight by the fact that in a specific moment, it sees the whole, it sees the totality, brings forward the other moment which is opposed to it, and converting one into the other, begins to notice the negative essence of both thoughts, begins to notice the notion. So he says, to faith, this seems like a perversion. Why are you taking these things? And I've drawn this in this way just to show sort of like how you can make all these sort of contradictions, Why are you taking these things in this way? If you just read this commentary over here, or if you just had better, practices, or if you had faith, you would understand that all these things do fit together. That it just looks like there's a contradiction. It's not really a contradiction. And insight's like, listen, buddy, there's a contradiction there. You're not getting out of it that easy. You say you believe in this, and you believe in this, and you believe in this, but you can't believe in these at the same time. So what gives? Are you going to remain in the contradiction? Are you going to purify, say, the religious system of the things that don't actually fit? If you do that, then enlightenment can help you out, but then enlightenment can help you out. And they're in charge then, right? Very quickly, and faith isn't going to want that. So he says, to faith, it seems to be a perversion and a lie, because it points out what? The otherness of its moments. You just don't understand. These are all parts of a big way of looking at things. You're separating things out that actually have to be understood in their organic relations to each other. Now the person of faith starts to sound like a Hegelian, don't they? That's not all that surprising. So he says, in doing this for faith, enlightenment seems directly to make something else out of them. Remember in the last paragraph we talked about not just perversion, but alteration or changing. From the perspective of faith, each of these modes or thoughts or aspects or dimensions is what it is. Insight is taking each of them and making them into something different, misrepresenting them. Think back again to that discussion that we had in another paragraph about the right to non-self-identity, the right to be non-identical, to change things, to say, well, you want to keep it this way, understood this way for all eternity, but I can also understand it a different way. And when I do, these things are in contradiction with each other. And you've got a problem, faith. So he says, here we go on. To faith, it seems to be a perversion. In doing so, it makes something else out of them than they are in their separateness. He says, but this other is equally essential, and in truth is present in the believing consciousness itself, in the faith consciousness. Only this does not think about it, but puts it away somewhere. It ignores the potential contradictions. It says, I'll sort that out later. God will help me out with that. If God wants to reveal to me how these contradictions aren't really contradictions, God will do so. Or maybe I'll figure that out when I die and go to heaven, right? So he says, consequently, it is neither alien to faith, nor can faith disavow it. What is the it there? Insight, the enlightenment. It is inextricable from faith. Hegel seems to think that, at least in the Christian West, the kind of faith that is being developed, from, say, the late Middle Ages all the way through the Renaissance, the Reformation, into the early modern period, into the time of Enlightenment, cannot extricate itself from faith. It cannot simply retreat into a ghetto. It cannot simply turn back the clock. It can't say, well, we're not going to have any truck with this sort of thing. We're going to leave modernism behind. Those sorts of strategies are not going to work. Hegel is, in a sense, a liberal in the classic sense when it comes to how Christianity would need to readapt itself to the world that is being discovered through culture, through Enlightenment. It cannot simply retreat. It can't just wipe it out. The clock has been, ticking, and you can't turn it back. Faith, like he's saying here, it's not alien to Enlightenment, and faith can't disavow Enlightenment. So what is it going to do?